Authors Press.
Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio, welcoming you to another edition of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. And on the line with us today, we have T.C. Owen. We'll be discussing his fantastic book, POTUS, a political fantasy in 3 parts. And I will say, TC was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by some of the best movers in the business, Authors Press Publishing. So if you have a book that you'd like moved, move it through Authors Press. You can find them at authorspress.com. And guys, listen, it is an absolute pleasure to have TC here on the line with us today because his book that we're going to be discussing, listen, it's a fictional narrative, okay? But it's a fictional narrative that I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. One of the underlying themes, one of the underlying messages is really that leaders and politicians, of course, in this instance, will do and say pretty much anything to achieve power. Listen, I'm sure we can all find many examples of when that has been the case. And I mean, that's really the common theme. It's why a lot of people don't like politicians, right? And a lot of people don't like salesmen because they're going to say what they need to say to earn your business or to get your vote or to get your money or something like that. So it's really revolving around something we all have experience with. We all can relate to, but it's done in a very creative way. It's a fictional narrative. It's pretty extensive. I mean, it's over 1,000 pages, so it's quite the journey that we get to go and take with the main protagonist, but it's such an exciting ride. And I'm so excited that we have TC here on the line because, listen, he's the expert, okay? He's done the research. He's created the narrative. He's going to be able to articulate all the nuance in his book much better than I ever could. So without further ado, let's bring him here with us. TC, first and foremost, thank you so much for being a guest with us today on People of Distinction. How are you?
Fine. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're very much looking forward to this. I know my listening audience is also at the edge of their seat waiting to hear about this. And again, as I stated, it revolves around content that we can all relate to. Now, before we jump into the book itself, TC, let's hold off slightly. Let's start off. Tell our listening audience a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I'm a former English teacher on the junior college and senior college level. Spent seemed like a lifetime doing that, and had a lot of downtime, and that's how I managed to come up with this book. I wrote a lot of it on campus in between classes, and then worked on it after that. The main reason I guess I wrote this book is because I noticed in the 1990s that there was too much Me Tooism, a rising level of what we call wokeness now, and a general tendency of the political class working far too hard to consolidate power in their hands at the expense of the people at large. In fact, the very first part of this thing I wrote, I call the State of the Union address that will never be heard, and it's included in the book, and it's an exegesis, I guess you could say, of what I saw, what I still see, and want people to kind of recognize and be aware and not caught up by being sold the things that are trying to be sold.
Mm-hmm. Now, TC, let's jump right in. POTUS, a political fantasy in 3 parts. Tell us a little bit about your book.
Okay, part 1 is relatively standard type activities, I guess, better way to phrase it, of a kind of a maverick president who doesn't care too much about power, doesn't care too much about wokeness or a general tendency of the political class to work too hard to consolidate power in their hands at the expense of the people. And it basically just delineates his basic human character. And after that, in parts 2 and 3, I incorporated science fiction based on still working on this same thing, but with people of other planets, and galaxies, and whatnot. What I hope people learn from the book is that they're the real leaders of their lives. They should never give up their rights in their lives to people who don't care about anything but power.
Thank you so much. Now, one thing that I'm really curious about, TC, is you have your main protagonist who ultimately becomes the President of the United States. I'm assuming, right? Because that's, of course, what is written there in the title. POTUS, we know, is an acronym for President of the United States. Now, you've stated that this protagonist is semi-reluctant, right? So it's not really something that he wants to do. Why did you decide to make your main character in that fashion?
Well, that's part of the backstory. Actually, I start the whole shebang with him delivering a State of the Union address, and goes from there. And at the end of it, he's attacked by some of the wokes and others, and has to deal with that. And that's a recurring thing throughout the whole book. Mm-hmm. He's always seems like having to fight, sometimes with words, sometimes with weapons, and sometimes just with sheer stubbornness, I guess is the word to use, about pursuing his goal of bringing freedom to the people of this world, and later on in the book to people of other worlds. What I'm trying to do here is make the whole point of that freedom is something that sentients everywhere in the galaxy should look for, and not necessarily try to just make do and be quiet and not try to work towards freedom. Yeah, that may not have come out quite the way I wanted it to be, but that's really what it's all about. It's about freedom.
Next concept that I'd love to get into, TC, let's talk about the concept of inspiration. Now, I know you've already started to articulate really why you felt compelled to even examine this political climate, right? I mean, you mentioned how you recognized within our own political climate, and really with a lot of people revolving around our political climate in terms of just the citizens, how the culture was switching and how it was starting to go down a particular path. So we understand what inspired you or what compelled you to look into the matter. Now, why didn't it end there? I mean, you proceeded and you wrote a 1,000-page book. Why did you feel that the public would be able to benefit from this narrative as well?
Well, what I hope it will do is that in the process of telling the story of my main character, that they realize that they're being had by the political culture in this country, and then begin to work toward running those people out of the country, or at least taking them out of office, so we can get back to being what we're supposed to be, free. And freedom, to me, is the most important part of the whole deal. If we're not free to be ourselves, then we're slaves. And I'm seeing a lot of stuff nowadays that tells me that if we let these politicians now get their way, this is going to become a slave nation.
Guys, again, here in the line with T.C. Owen. We're discussing his book, POTUS, a political fantasy in 3 parts. Now, T.C., next concept that I want to go into, and sticking with inspiration. So we know what inspired you to write this particular book. Stepping away slightly from this book, I'm curious, you talked about your background being in education. Right, you were a professor for a long time. Now, what inspired you to embark upon a creative journey of this magnitude and become a writer?
I was seeing the various colleges and junior colleges that I was dealing with were beginning to move more and more towards a system I didn't like. Too repressive, too cold, and I'm not a particularly hot-blooded person, but I like to work with my students in a way that I could make a difference in their lives as well as educating them. And the education is what changed their lives. But I kept running up against obstacles, I guess we could call them, that get right smack in the way. I had colleagues that failed students because they didn't agree with them. That sort of thing. And finally, I just got so tired of it. I started writing the book, and as I said, I wrote that State of the Union address. Finally, I got into the book, and finally, I just said, what the heck? I'm just going to walk away and retire and do whatever I can do to survive until I can get this book written.
What type of research, TC, did you do in preparation for this book?
Really, the research angle on it is based on my experiences, based on what I've learned from teaching various people and, playwrights, novelists, and whatnot. I got to see a whole lot of things that most people would never come close to getting to see, especially nowadays. That's what prepared me to start thinking about writing this book. And as I said, I wrote the State of the Union that will never be heard first. It took me a while to get that one right. And then I got to thinking, that's a good starting place, and just go ahead and get going with the book. So I started thinking about that, and it went from there. It took a while, to be honest. I'd stop and think about things, about what I'm saying and how I can make it fit my basic theme, as opposed to just throwing a bunch of words on a page like I've seen in some books that don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. The preparation was in many ways life preparation and work preparation that I dealt with. Before I got it back into teaching after I left in the early 70s, I was in retail, which was a real thrill. But I've met thousands of people, some good, some bad, some just neither here nor there. So I got a sense of the people and how they could be convinced about this, that, and the other. And then I went back into teaching and met all kinds of students. Those from being pretty sharp and pretty up and fairly well educated themselves to some who could just barely identify a pencil. And that was the big challenge in the teaching, and also taught me more things. And sometimes, surprisingly, some of the ones who were more or less the best educated were the worst and the most docile and willing to just fall in line with whoever taught them what to do, told them what to do, rather. Mm-hmm. It's my whole life history fed me the ideas and the abilities to do the book.
Now, what would you say was a highlight for you in writing this book, TC? Or if not a highlight, maybe something that surprised you that you weren't expecting prior to embarking upon the journey?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that quite as much. I think probably the best way I can get to that question is this way, is I learned a lot about myself and what I believe and what I think in the process of writing. That's why it took me, seemed like 37 years to write it, but it was only about 6 or 8. So I'm, being an old English teacher, I'm pretty hardcore on how things are placed on the page, I guess is the way to say it.
Fantastic. I agree with you, man. Listen, given this political climate and the way things are going, a lot of times we're not as free as we think we are, or we're not as free as it appears on the surface. So I'm very glad that we had you here on the show today to discuss your fantastic book. Guys, listen, one last time. Here on the line with TC Owen. We just finished discussing his fantastic book, POTUS, a political fantasy in 3 parts. Available again at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. TC, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you once again for being a guest with us today on People of Distinction.
Thank you for having me.